What's going on, chess YouTube? In today's video, Daniel Naroditsky bamboozles Magnus Carlsen with an absolutely ludicrous attacking game. Now, when I first saw this game, I was completely shocked. I mean, just look at this position from move 18 in this game. Daniel Naroditsky launching the attack with the pawns. He's effectively all in on the king side here. And don't worry, this is just move 18. There were more than 40 total moves played in this game, and wow, what a game this was. So the bottom line is, if you want to see the streamer and grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky launch an all-out attack against the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen himself, then you do not want to miss this game. Alright, in the game, Magnus Carlsen opens 1e4 best by test, and here Daniel Naroditsky, he goes for the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense as his weapon of choice against 1e4, and this is also my favorite opening as 1e4, so this is going to be a fun game for me to analyze. Alright, now here Magnus, he plays literally everything against the Najdorf. Today, he goes for the quiet line with bishop e2. This was a favorite of Karpov and other grandmasters from the past. Now here, black goes e5. This is the standard move, striking in the center. Now knight b3, bishop e7, castles, and castles from black. Now from here, the main line of the bishop e2 variation against the Najdorf involves going bishop e3, then queen to d3, and then finally knight d5. And after black takes on d5, we get a very imbalanced pawn structure. Now Magnus gets there via 9 queen d3 instead of 9 bishop e3. This is just a different wrinkle on the variation. Now bishop e6, bishop b3, transposing back to the main line. Black goes knight b to d7, the standard move. And here Magnus has two main options as white if he's trying to fight for an advantage in the opening. Now the older quiet line is to go a4 to a5, clamping down on the queen side. So for example, here's a sample line of best play from both sides. a4, rook c8, a5, clamping down. Then black continues developing, both sides get the rooks out, and finally black goes knight to c5. This is a line that Karpov loved to play as white, but instead of this, Magnus Carlsen goes for a more imbalanced idea. That is simply jumping in with the knight to the d5 square immediately, knight to d5 on the board. Now here, black's position is already pretty critical. You cannot allow white to win that bishop on the e7 square. After that point, this pawn on d6 will not have the bishop defending it, and it's going to fall very, very fast after, say, rook to d1. So with that in mind, black here has to immediately chop off that knight with the move bishop takes d5. So this is the best, and by the way, knight takes d5 is simply not possible here. For example, after knight takes d5, then d takes. All of these squares on the king side are not available for the bishop, and black is going to lose the bishop for effectively nothing here. So that would be a huge blunder. So back to the game. Bishop takes d5, played by Daniel Naroditsky, and now e takes d5 from Magnus. Alright, it's a good time to slow down and talk strategy. Now here, Magnus Carlsen as white, he has that pawn majority on the queen side, having those 4 pawns versus the 3 pawns of Daniel Naroditsky. And that means Magnus's plan here is going to involve launching those pawns forward, trying to create some sort of pass pawn on the queen side. And of course, there are a variety of ways of doing it, but the basic plan is you launch the A pawn, perhaps to A4, A5, the B pawn to B4, and then finally prepare some sort of C5 breakthrough, at which point there's going to be a pass pawn somewhere for white. Now, of course, black here has his own trumps, and he's going to play on the king side. As you can see, black having the 4 versus 3 pawn majority on the king side, and that means black's plan is going to involve moving that knight away from the f6 square, then playing for f5, and perhaps even e4 and f4, as you saw in the intro. And yes, that is going to happen in the game. Things are going to get wild here. Now here, it is black's turn to move. What is he going to do to get his attack going? Well, there are a few different ideas. First of all, playing on the queen side with a5. It's a very thematic idea in these types of positions, but after a5, a4, white has the entire queen side on lockdown. c4 to c5 is coming, and typically this is not the right idea for black here. Instead, he has a few different ways to get the kingside attack going. One idea is knight to e8, intending f5 immediately. That is a very strong idea for black. The other idea is simply h5, try to clamp down, perhaps following up rook to c8 and kind of slow playing the position a little bit. But in the game, Daniel goes for a different idea. That is simply g6. It's a very good multi-purpose move. For example, it does sort of prepare the idea of h5, and black may even go knight to e8, then to g7 with the knight. That's going to be a decent square for the knight, and then follow up with the move f5, try to get the counterplay going. Now from here, Magnus, he expands on the queen side with the move a4, and real fast, there are a few different ideas he had. For example, bishop h6 may look tempting. However, rook e8 is not that bad of a move for black. And here, black is doing perfectly fine. He has all sorts of ways to get the f5 break going in the game. Now, another tempting idea for Magnus would have been the move c4 here. This move looks very logical, setting up c4 to c5. But here, this is actually where the move a5 from black comes in handy. Here, if white follows up a4, the best move, This is not the kind of structure you want for white when you have these pawns on a4 and a5. When this is the case, you actually want the pawn back on the c2 square, because then you can use the b5 square for the queen to put pressure on the queen side. So for example, here black could simply go b6, and white's counterplay on the queen side would be slowed down. This would be very good for black. And of course, Magnus Carlsen knows all this. He is the GOAT of chess after all. And that's why in this position, he simply expands on the queen side with the move a4. Very, very solid. Now black goes a5. Then ideas like queen b5 are going to come into play. Now here, Daniel Naroditsky, it's time for him to get the attack going. He starts that with the move knight to e8. Very good move. Perhaps intending knight g7 in some lines. And of course, that f5 break is coming very shortly. Now here, Magnus expands on the queen side. Good idea. Locking down the queen side, perhaps setting up a support square for the bishop on b6 in some lines as well. And now here, Daniel, he has a few different options. It's very tricky trying to figure out when black should immediately break with the move f5 versus when he should slow play it. Now here for black, one option is simply knight to g7. Very good idea. Of course, that was kind of the purpose of g6 earlier, going knight f6 to e8 to g7. And here, best play for both sides involves simply developing the pieces and white starting his expansion on the queen side, black getting his rooks out onto the c8 and e8 squares, and from here he's looking ready to break with something like f5 or even e4 in the future. Now instead of this, Daniel goes for another very thematic Najdorf idea. That is the idea of actually exchanging off the dark squared bishop with the move bishop to g5. Now, this is a very double-edged idea for black in the Najdorf. Typically, it works well when that pawn on d6 does not need additional defense. So in this kind of structure, it's very, very good. Of course, the dark squared bishop being sort of a bad bishop here. And beyond that, black is trying to get rid of Magnus Carlsen's bishop pair in this position. So very solid idea. Now from here, Magnus c4, simply expanding on the queen side. Good stuff. And here, Daniel, he goes rook to c8. Now, this is complicated, but the computer seems to think actually trading on e3 right away is the better move. So, for example, bishop takes, queen takes, then going knight to g7, and you're pretty much ready for the f5 break on the queen side. Now, why is this important? Well, after the move rook to c8, c8 really doesn't do a whole lot to slow down white's expansion on the queen side. After all, Magnus here was intending the idea of knight d2, then b4, and finally c5. And at that point, the rook move is sort of a waste of tempo. There are better things Daniel could have done besides rook c8 to get his attack going on the king side. For example, knight g7, f5, and so on. So now Magnus, after rook c8, simply knight to d2. Very good. Of course, Magnus is setting up the idea of b2 to b4, and then c5. Now, Daniel f5, he has to get the attack going on the king side as soon as he can. This is super, super important. Now, of course, you may be wondering, why didn't Daniel simply take on the e3 square? Well, there is this sort of little dance going on between white and black with these bishops here. Now, of course, if black takes, white's going to get the tempo with the queen going to e3, for example, here instead of f5. If bishop takes, queen takes, and the queen is on a decent square, it does eye the c5 square. While on the other hand, if Magnus Carlsen were to take on g5, for example, f5, then bishop takes, queen takes, suddenly the queen is actually somewhat active on the g5 square. So both sides kind of get hurt if they trade on either e3 or g5, and for that reason, the bishop just kind of stay on the board for a little while now. Now here, Magnus, b4, very logical move, simply increasing the expansion on the queen side, threatening c5 next, and here is where Daniel Naroditsky turns up the heat. All right, here, Daniel, e4 is the move, hitting the queen with the pawn. Oh boy, Magnus here has a big decision to make. Where do you go with the queen? And then what's going to happen next from Daniel? All right, well, it turns out here the queen is almost booby-trapped. Almost everything Magnus can do is going to be bad. For example, queen d4, that does not work because bishop to f6. And then, believe it or not, literally the only square for the queen is going to be a7. So, for example, queen a7. But then you lose the rook on the a1 square. Rook takes, and then black is not done here. f4 is the move, continuing the attack. And now the queen is so far away from the defense of the king side, this would be an absolute disaster for white. So obviously, queen d4 is not the move. What about queen b3 here? Is that good? Well, it turns out the answer is no. Once again, black just goes for it with f4. And then after bishop d4, the move is f3. Oh my goodness, blowing open the king side. Now Magnus here, once again, of course, he is the GOAT. He finds the right move. That is queen to c3. This is literally the only move that keeps the advantage for white. Everything else is just a nuclear disaster for white. All right, of course, Daniel, though, he's not done. f4 is the move. And now we have that position from the intro. All right, now Magnus Carlsen, once again, has a very critical decision to make. What the heck do you do about these pawns? And of course, the bishop on e3 being attacked. Well, it's very, very difficult to find a good move. For example, if you go bishop d4, then black's going to follow up f3 anyway. Oh no, this is so bad for white. I mean, obviously, g takes f3 is almost never a good idea in these kinds of positions. For example, if you go bishop d1 instead, even that doesn't work out. Black simply takes the knight on d2, threatening the queen. You got to take back. And then black infiltrates with the queen to the h4 square. And oh my goodness, that queen is an absolute monster. The queen and the rook lining up here, creating all sorts of threats. I would not want to be Magnus Carlsen as white in this position. So with that in mind, Magnus finds pretty much the only good idea. It's definitely not bishop d4 here. Instead, Magnus goes bishop to g4. What a move. Oh my goodness, he's literally sacrificing the bishop on the e3 square. Okay, this is where the game gets absolutely insane. All right, here black obviously takes the bishop, f takes e3. What else are you going to do? But here Magnus shows his idea. Bishop to e6 is the move, checking the king. And now, of course, this diagonal is blocked off. The king can't go to g7 or h8. So with that in mind, what is black supposed to do? Well, he has one legal move here, essentially. Rook to f7, blocking the check, but you give up the exchange. So, okay, here Magnus, obviously, the knight on d2 is being threatened. Knight takes e4 is the move, threatening the bishop. Very solid move by Magnus. But here, Daniel Naroditsky, he doesn't slow down. e2 on the board. He's threatening. E takes f1, promoting to a queen. What the heck is happening in this game? All right, here Magnus, he's still better for all the craziness that is happening. But once again, he has more problems to solve. What do you do here? Do you move the rook? Do you take the rook? What's it going to be? Well, in the game, Magnus does move the rook. Rook to e1, very logical looking move. However, it was quite a bit weaker than the alternative. The best move for white here is going to be bishop takes f7, capturing the rook. Now, here's why this is good. After king takes, you have the intermediate move, queen to f3, forking both the pawn and the king. The king's got to go somewhere, or you got to block it. For example, bishop f6 is probably the best move here for black. But from here, the attack continues. The bishop, of course, is being pinned, and that gives white the opportunity to go rook f to c1, defending the pawn on c4. Bishop takes a1, not possible because of the pin from the queen on the king. So overall, bishop takes f7 would have been a slightly better move, according to the computer. Instead, rook to e1 by Magnus. This was a blitz game. They're in time pressure. Very understandable. And now here, Daniel Nardoditsky finds the key move. Bishop to f6, putting pressure on the queen, of course. And now Magnus, what is he supposed to do? Does he sack the exchange? Does he do something else? Well, in the game, he goes bishop takes f7, better late than ever. Now king takes, knight takes f6, and queen takes back. And then queen to h3 by Magnus. Very interesting move, lining up with that pawn on h7, creating even more threats. And rewinding a little bit, I gotta show you, trading queens here is simply not a good idea for Magnus at all, shockingly. If you go queen takes f6, black is going to get a tremendous endgame. For example, right here, you gotta defend that pawn on the c4 square. Rook to c1 is the best move. But then black jumps in with the knight, knight to e5. White finally captures the pawn on the e2 square. And then you add the disrespect with the move knight takes d5, and of course the pawn is pinned to the rook. That is not possible. Oh wow, what a disrespectful knight move. All right, going back to the game, this just shows why the endgame is simply not a good idea. And once again, Magnus playing the best idea, queen to h3, keeping the queens on the board and targeting that weak pawn on the h7 square. Now here, Daniel, queen f5, once again offering that queen trade. Of course, the endgame is going to be better for him, but Magnus declines. Queen takes h7, then knight g7, blocking the queen check. And here Magnus, instead of going rook takes e2, he plays a very creative idea. That is rook to a2. He wants to recapture the pawn with the a rook instead. So very interesting, but of course this whole plan does sacrifice the pawn on the c4 square. Daniel jumps in immediately. Rook takes c4, rook a takes e2 from Magnus. And here Daniel jumps in with the knight to the e5 square, knight to e5, trying to cut off the activity of these rooks on this open e-file. So very good idea from Daniel. Now things have finally slowed down a little bit. Let's talk strategy and recap here. What the heck is going on? Well, in this position here, black has 2 extra knights, white has the extra rook, and he has a pawn majority on the queen side, the 3 pawns versus the 1 pawn from black. So overall here, Magnus Carlsen does have extra material. He's up about 1 pawn versus black. However, things are very, very complicated. And black does have a lot of activity with these knights, the queen, and the rook. And overall, black might even be slightly better here. Now from here, Magnus plays the move h3. Very logical waiting move, creating some extra law for the king, getting rid of backrank mating threats ideas. And now black queen g5, threatening rook to c1 and so lines. And here in this position, Magnus Carlsen, he goes off the d-bet. And I don't say that lightly. He goes absolutely berserk. I have no clue what this move was supposed to accomplish. You may have guessed it. He sacrifices the rook on e5. Rook takes e5. but this turns out to be a major blunder. Black just takes back with the d-pawn. And now, look at this position. What the heck did Magnus Carlsen accomplish with sacrificing the rook? Here he was doing fine, and here he's literally down an entire piece. I mean, yes, he has 2 pawns, but even Magnus Carlsen's remaining pawns on the queen side are getting very, very weak. b4 is already very, very weak, being threatened by the rook. And what is Magnus supposed to do here? I don't know. Well, he starts queen h8, trying to activate the queen along the back rank somehow. And now Daniel's showing the idea of queen to g5 earlier. He simply goes rook to c1, forcing off the last pair of rooks. And that means his remaining knight is going to be even more important in this position. And of course, the knight and the queen do synergize together very, very well for black. So Magnus has his work cut out for him trying to come back in this game. Now Magnus, king h2, queen f4 check from black, king g1, and finally queen takes b4. Of course, Daniel had the draw for in hand with queen to c1, but instead he plays on. Now here Magnus, queen to b8, trying to get some activity with the queen, of course, putting pressure on that b7 pawn and the pawn on the e5 square. And knight f5 from Daniel, finally getting the knight into the game. All right, now Magnus takes on e5. Black takes on a5. This may have been slightly dubious. Instead, queen to d6 would have been a better move, trying to centralize the queen and trying to get the queens off the board if possible. Now, going back to the game, queen takes a5 on the board. Magnus gives the check on the e6 square. And while this move is fine, there is an insane computer idea I have to show you in this position. The move for Magnus technically is actually g4, getting space on the king side and threatening the knight. All right, here Daniel has to retreat the knight if this was played in the game, knight g7. And I just want to show you this line. Queen f4, king g8, queen b8, king a7, and then finally the whole point of this line is d6. And believe it or not, Daniel actually has a very difficult time trying to stop this pawn from promoting. So overall, this idea of g4 would have been very, very strong for Magnus if he found it. That would have been enough to basically get drawing chance in this game. Now instead, queen e6 on the board, king g7, and from here Magnus managed to win one more pawn, that pawn on the b7 square, but it is simply not enough. Here Daniel closes in on the king, queen to e1, the right square for the queen. Now king h2 from Magnus, Daniel takes the pawn on f2, and Magnus Carlsen's king is looking like it's in deep trouble here. All right, Magnus picks up one more pawn on the a6 square. Queen takes a6, but now Daniel, knight to e3, threatening queen takes g2, checkmate. Magnus Carlsen is about to get mated, and in this position, he simply resigned on the spot to Daniel Naroditsky. There is no good way to defend the g2 square. Now, real fast, literally the only way to delay checkmate is to go queen to a2, indirectly defending the g2 square, but then you lose the queen. And after that, the game is effectively over. I mean, wow, what a game by Daniel Naroditsky. That was some insane attacking chess. And of course, this was my favorite position from the game. Just look at this here with these absolutely insane pawns launching down the board. All right, Chess YouTube, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give me a like and subscribe and check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist. And I'll see you in the next video.